We are live on the floor of the 2014 Global Technology Leaders Summit, and I'm here with Jim Howpert, who is U.S. Leader and Global Co-Chair of DLA Piper's Data Privacy, Protection, and Security Practice. And Jim, you just finished moderating a very eye-opening panel titled, "Is Silicon Valley Losing the Cybersecurity War?" Now, before we get to that question, because it's an important one, I want to ask you a few before it.
Sure.
With data breaches making the headlines the world over, and there were a couple of big ones this past week, what steps do companies need to be taking now to protect themselves from cyber attacks?
Well, it's an inevitability that some sort of security incident is going to happen to a company. So companies really need to prepare, assuming that this will happen, and make sure they're as prepared as possible. There's one set of proactive measures that really involves incident response preparedness. It involves making sure that you've got a secure and privileged and confidential reporting channel when there's a suspected incident, so you can make sure that you're controlling what information is available to regulators or other third parties about your incident. You need to make sure that you've got an enterprise-wide team that's available 24/7, representing all the key constituencies within your company, both the customer relations or marketing side, IT, HR, in some cases also the communications team, so that you've got everybody working as a team to address the security incident when it happens, and it will usually happen over the weekend. In addition, you need to have, as part of your information security plan, a set of third parties that you can turn to whom you already have engaged at reasonable rates to do forensic work if that's necessary. You need to also know if you've got an insurance policy, because insurance policies can be quite helpful in reducing risks and costs associated with these sorts of events. And you need to make sure that you've got a forensic vendor, as well as entities like call center operators and others whom you can contact. They know you, they make you a priority, because you're going to need to move and move fast in response to these incidents. There's a second set of components of preparedness which are not incident response, they're actually prevention. And they won't be 100% successful, but it's very important that you're looking at managing risks associated with the crown jewels within your organization. You can encrypt, for example, payment card data, social security numbers of individuals, the sort of information that would trigger a security breach. If that information is encrypted, then you don't have a notification obligation, and that can save you hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. You also need to think about protecting trade secrets. You need to have multiple layers of security behind your firewall, because it's so easy to get around the firewall today, to make that information very, very difficult for somebody to take out of your network. You also need to have very strong monitoring and security detection technologies in place in your network to look for anomalies, to find the malware that's lodged in your system before your adversary is actually exfiltrating data to some place where they're going to use it to compete with you or to hurt your company. So it's a multi-factored defense strategy that involves both. You also need to have strong training. So it's a multi-factor defense strategy that involves training of your employees, having secure security measures in place to protect your most valuable assets from hackers, and then also having very strong monitoring and detection so that you can catch malware in your system before you start losing data. All of those are essential to a successful response strategy for hacking attacks.
Okay, so building on that point, I know during the panel you explored a number of best practices and proposed legal and enforcement responses concerning hacking and data theft. What were some of the key takeaways that came out of that discussion?
Well, key takeaways are, first of all, don't assume that because you're small you won't be an attack victim. Hackers love to go through smaller organizations, through vendors. If you look at what happened to Target, for example, it was their HVAC vendor that was remotely controlling heating and air conditioning systems that was used as the vector to get into Target's network. Target had very good security, but the hackers looked for the weakest link and got in and penetrated their network. The second thing that's very important to think about is, are you really spending your money on information security in a way that's allocated toward current risks? There's a lot of money that's been spent on firewall technologies that are sort of Maginot Line, because hackers are now able to use phishing or other exploitation, for example, through using entities like vendors who interconnect with systems to get around the firewall. And then if you don't have the multiple layers of security behind the firewall, you're not encrypting information, keeping the encryption keys separate from that information, you're very, very vulnerable. Another best practice in this area is to make sure that you're sharing information and receiving information on emerging threats. This is a highly dynamic threat area. It's really the opposite of, for example, designing a car to get around product liability risk. Here you've got attackers who are innovating constantly. It costs them very little money to do that. And the business community is left playing defense. So it's very important to make sure that you're hearing about attacks that are happening to others in your sector, and you're adjusting your defenses in light of that. And by the same token, you need to share information back as part of these information sharing networks so that you can help benefit the overall ecosystem. Everybody loses if they're not up on the latest sort of security exploits, and it's vitally important that companies participate in that and continue to raise their defenses as the attackers use more and more sophisticated ways to get into company systems.
Okay, great. In DLA Piper's 2014 Technology Leaders Forecast Survey, which we're launching in conjunction with this event today, tech leaders ranked data privacy and security as one of the top risk and compliance concerns impacting their companies in the year ahead, more so than regulatory requirements, more so than IP protection, and more so than increased litigation. I thought that was eye-opening to see how high this is on their list of concerns. What is your response to that?
Well, I think they're right. If you look at just what the headlines have contained in terms of business news over the past year, a lot of the business news has related to privacy and security risks and slip-ups. And it's really vitally important that companies take this risk seriously and that they understand that data is one of their most important assets in the information age, but it's also one of the most important potential risks if it's not protected adequately. And it's not about avoiding all hacks, it's about having strong defenses in line, also have to screen in advance uses of consumer data to make sure that they're not going to cause reputational risk to the company or potentially legal risks or class action risks. So having a strong information governance system and also cyber risk governance system is a great way to act on that concern, and I think we'll see more and more companies turning to this. We know that our clients are doing it, we're helping them to do it, and in general they're becoming more prepared to reduce both the chance of these risks happening and also the severity of a mishap, because human beings are fallible, they'll make mistakes, but if you have a strong program in place, you can really control for that risk and reduce it significantly.
Okay. Now, 53% of these same executives told us that state-sponsored organizations who are interested in accessing intellectual property will be the primary threat to information security in the year ahead. Is this consistent with what you're seeing as well?
Oh, it certainly is, and particularly in terms of technology companies, pharma companies, other companies that have a lot of very valuable trade secret IP that they're in theory protecting, but it's increasingly hard with the sophistication of these attacks. But the figure isn't higher because for retailers, for example, it's not so much their trade secrets that are at risk, it's really their customer data. Right. And there's also a very sophisticated black market on the internet where elements of the underworld, the hacker underworld, are obtaining vast amounts of particularly payment card data and selling it for as much as $100 per record on hacker forums in the dark web. And so there's a real market for this information, and that sort of risk is also on top of mind. And increasingly you're finding hackers that are sharing tools. So The U.S. and Israel, for example, used the Stuxnet worm to get in, quite famously, to the Iranian nuclear program and cause damage. The Stuxnet worm pretty quickly was out in the wild and being used by hackers who were not nearly as sophisticated. So assume that the nation-state tools are also falling into the hands of these kind of professional information thieves who also use it to get in systems. You even have now bad actors who are renting access to companies' networks. So they're sophisticated enough to get in, have a way into the system, and then they'll rent access in the dark web for a day, 2 days, or a longer period, and then rent it to others as well. So this market is really evolving, where you have technically sophisticated players who develop nation-state players who develop very sophisticated hacking tools. You then have individuals who are quite technically sophisticated, who know how to use them, and they're in turn, in some cases, renting access to networks to other third parties. So you have a quite efficient market developing to exploit holes in security that have been forged in company networks, and it's important to take note of that and be ready to respond.
So it's quite the interconnected web, for sure.
Yes.
So let's get back to the original question and title of the panel, and that is Silicon Valley losing the cybersecurity war? Now, one of your fellow panelists said, in fact, we are, and on a few very important levels. What is your assessment of that?
Well, it depends to some extent about what you call losing, but if it means behind in the score, I think Silicon Valley right now is behind in the score, and part of it's that they're playing against a very strong team that's sharing all its offensive weapons.
Right.
So you're seeing a lot of hacking attacks on companies to steal intellectual property and trade secrets in particular. But in terms of the second threat, in some ways that's been a bigger one right now for U.S. companies, and it's the revelations from Edward Snowden of the prevalence of NSA surveillance, or the sophistication of NSA surveillance tools, which has led to a great suspicion, particularly in countries like Germany and in Europe that really have a bad history of totalitarian state actors violating individual privacy. And that's led to a real suspicion of U.S. technology vendors that have been used to either treat, process, or store in the cloud, for example, data coming from Europe. And so we've seen quarterly reports from major Silicon Valley powers. We've seen reports coming out of a real decline in sales in Europe caused by the revelations of NSA surveillance. And we're regularly called upon to write memos for technology clients explaining why, for example, the NSA would not be able to get access to customer data. This is part of the sales pitch of European companies that want to take business away from U.S. technology companies.
Okay, so it sounds like Silicon Valley definitely has some work to do here in the months ahead.
The U.S. government can take some steps to reassure the European marketplace that it's not going to take, for example, corporate information from European corporates and hand that information over to U.S. Competing companies the way some other foreign states are doing now. And I firmly believe the U.S. government doesn't do this, and it would be very helpful to clarify that through an amendment in U.S. law, actually, to set the record straight. Thank you.
So to switch gears slightly, I understand that you're getting ready to launch a new real-time cybersecurity compliance tool called CyberTrack. I had a chance to do a very brief demo of it about 20 minutes ago, but it's designed to help multinational companies develop strategies to protect their businesses. This sounds like a very timely and unique offering from what I can tell. What can you tell me about it?
CyberTrack contains 5 key features right now that we think will be very important for companies that are assessing how to deploy security solutions globally. The first is what security requirements or security standards are imposed by laws or regulations. We're going to augment that in the next release of Cybertrack, which we expect to be in the winter, with actual mapping to information security standards that are used in different countries around the world. We think that'll be very powerful and useful for CISOs and chief information officers to help guide their purchasing decisions. The second aspect is actual restrictions on use of security technologies. There are countries like Russia and China that don't allow use of unlicensed encryption products in their countries. And so when one considers how to deploy security defenses in those countries, these are major considerations that companies need to be aware of. A third category is restrictions on use of monitoring technologies. A key way to detect the inevitable intrusions from hacking attacks is to monitor traffic that's flowing out of a corporate network. And there are a number of countries like Germany that have very strong privacy rules that create restrictions on deployment of those technologies. So what we're doing is to map all these both security requirements and obstacles to security. And then finally, an additional category that's very relevant is obligations to report security incidents, both security breaches of personal data, which in the United States have long been a feature of information security law, but that are coming online in many countries around the world. And in addition, requirements if you're in a critical infrastructure sector, for example, like power or financial services, to report security incidents to regulators in your country. And we think this combination of tools will be very useful. It will be updated every 4 months, roughly, and will provide a way for companies to map their requirements around the world and also the obstacles to deploying security solutions. So we're very excited about it. After talking to the board of our partner organization in this, the Internet Security Alliance, which is comprised of CIOs and CISOs of 18 major multinationals, we learned that there really is no service of this kind available today, and we think it will really meet an important market need, not only for CISOs and chief information officers, but for GC's offices, for compliance offices, and for risk offices in multinationals and domestic companies around the world.
Okay, that sounds very interesting. And the final question about that for me is, are there specific types of companies and specific industries that you think can benefit most from this software, such as highly regulated industries? What can you tell us about that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, highly regulated industries in the healthcare sector, financial services sector, those tend to be the most regulated around the world. This is a tool that will be very, very useful to them. It's also very useful to companies that simply hold customer data for which they might have some sort of security breach obligation or be fined if they had inadequate security. And it's very useful to internet security companies to help them to make the case for deployment of their security solutions, not only in the United States, but around the world. And more generally, cybersecurity is just a growing threat to companies across business sectors, and being aware of these requirements, which are changing rapidly, is almost as important as being aware of the evolving security threats. If you could potentially be fined, or if you've made a commitment in contracts with a potential customer to meet a standard of care or the applicable security requirements in the countries in which your technology is being deployed, you need to be up on what those requirements are and be sure that you're compliant.
Okay, great. Well, again, that was Jim Howpert of DLA Piper. Jim,
thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
It.